The private tasting in the oak-paneled Speyside room had been a club of old names. Then sample 7, a single malt from an unnamed distillery, was poured.
Smells like a warehouse experiment.
He let the amber liquid coat his tongue for 2 seconds, then spat into the spittoon with a wet, decisive crack.
Barely fit for cooking.
A few distillers around the table laughed, quickly and nervously.
Perhaps the gentleman should focus on rum. Scotch isn't for everyone.
Malcolm Sinclair's thin smile disappeared. He looked down at his notes. Alexander Robinson, seated at the far end, reached forward without a word and picked up the bottle. The cap screwed back on with a single firm turn. The label, facing out, read Glen Ardoch, Distiller. Robinson. The room had spoken, but the liquid inside had been silenced before it could answer. Alexander rose slowly. The room stayed silent, thick with the sting of judgment.
This is Scotch, not sorrel tea. You lot have rum.
Malcolm Sinclair's gaze dropped to his nosing-glass. A few other distillers fidgeted with their notes. Alexander paused at the door, just long enough for the silence to ache, then walked out. Outside, a cold Speyside rain was falling, streaking the warm lights of the old stone venue. He slid into the driver's seat. The door closed with a quiet, final click. His hands settled on the steering wheel, still and steady.
12 years. 3 houses. And I am still the rum man.
Only a tight clench in his jaw betrayed the fire burning beneath the calm. He turned the ignition and drove into the rain. The tasting room lights dissolved behind him, and the whiskey's truth rode on in the silence, unanswered. The next morning, a heavy silence hung over Glen Ardoch. The mist clung to the stone building like a held breath. When Alexander walked into the stillhouse, his 2 young workers looked away. They had already heard. His assistant, a retired chemist, stopped him at the office door with a printout in hand. The headline read, "Rum Novice Stumbles into Scotch Tasting. McAllister Unimpressed."
12 years of apprenticeship, and this is the story they'll run?
A lone email pinged on his laptop. The subject line read, "Your Glen Ardoch sample. I tasted this blind weeks ago, and it stopped me cold. Remarkably elegant. Who are you?" He glanced at the framed photograph on the desk, his father's patient smile urging patience. He closed the email without replying. The small hope he tucked into his own silence. In the whiskey trade, one quiet voice against a chorus of ridicule was barely a whisper, but it was a whisper that refused to die. A week later, in the amber warmth of the stillhouse, Alexander sealed the sample into a small wooden crate himself, in his own handwriting on the label. Glen Ardoch, 12-year, distiller, a Robinson.
They'll judge blind. Just the spirit, no color.
Later in his office, he paused before the framed photograph on his desk. His father, a rum distiller in the islands, who taught him to trust his nose. The road to this crate was lined with closed doors. 3 Scottish houses had taken him as an apprentice, but none made him master. Polite, firm letters told him there was no place for someone like him at the top of this industry.
I mortgaged the house Mum left. Every barrel is borrowed time.
The next morning, he drove the crate to the courier himself, leaving only a return address. 200 other entries would land on the same blind panel in 2 days. The whiskey would speak for itself, or not at all. In the stillness of the stillhouse that evening, all he could do was wait and trust what he had poured into the glass. 3 weeks later, the stillness of his office shattered. His assistant burst through the door, face flushed. "The website," he stammered. "It's crashed. The server says thousands of orders, all at once." Alexander's phone vibrated on the desk. A news alert. He picked it up. Jim Murray's Whiskey Bible 2024. Glen Ardoch 12-year-old scores 97.5 out of 100. World's best whiskey of the year. He stared at the screen without blinking, then set the phone down, very gently. Written very gently.
20 years. They finally tasted it.
Outside, a shout went up from the stillhouse. Then another. His small team was cheering. He stood at the window and watched them for a moment, but his face stayed serious.
Now the wolves will circle.
The industry that had called him a rum novice 3 weeks ago was now fighting to buy his whiskey. A 7-figure frenzy had begun. At McAllister Distillery, George's grand office filled with the clink of a victory cigar until his private line rang.
97.5. My own 30-year never passed 94. This is a farce.
He hurled his crystal tumbler at the fireplace. It shattered, splashing amber across the stone family crest.
Draft a statement. The Bible has lost credibility. This is a political stunt, not a tasting.
In Tokyo, Hiroshi Tanaka stepped into his sleek office. His assistant was already holding out a tablet. The front page of the whiskey trade was already lit with Glen Ardach's 97.5.
The McAllister deal was to be signed next week. If this score holds, the market will pivot overnight.
He scrolled through the order frenzy screenshots, crashed servers, sold out pre-orders, global demand. He opened a secure memo and typed, "Initiate full production capacity assessment on Glen Ardach." Discreetly, by noon, the board was briefed. The McAllister deal was suspended. All eyes pivoted to that small Highland distillery. 2 days later, in a Tokyo boardroom, Hiroshi laid out the Glen Ardach assessment. Small but sustainable stocks, a unique profile, and a global brand overnight. The senior director asked only one question: can we move fast enough? The vote was unanimous. The McAllister deal was dead. All resources redirected to securing Glen Ardach. Hiroshi was authorized to make direct contact with Alexander Robinson within 48 hours.
This distiller will not be bought easily. He has no reason to trust multinationals.
Meanwhile, at McAllister, George was on the phone with a columnist whose byline he had fed for years. The columnist owed him. Within hours, an opinion piece went live across the trade websites. Headline: Whiskey Bible's political correctness undermines real Scotch. The article called the award a diversity stunt and questioned the integrity of the blind tasting process. The smear was designed to poison the well before Hiroshi could make his offer. The call came late that afternoon. An assistant from a Tokyo conglomerate requested a meeting with Mr. Robinson.
They wasted no time. Every vulture wants a taste.
That evening, alone in the office, he opened the whiskey trade sites. The op-ed headline screamed at him, "Diversity stunt undermines real Scotch, McAllister supporters claim."
My nose never once consulted my skin.
He walked into the stillhouse alone, poured a dram of the 12-year-old, and nosed it slowly. The heather, the honey, the oak, all still there, as flawless as the day he barreled it.
The truth is in the glass. Always has been.
The next morning, he packed a small bag, left instructions with his assistant, and drove out of the Highland mist. By afternoon, he was in Edinburgh, walking into a glass and steel tower, his future uncertain, but his spirit unshaken. In the conference room, Hiroshi Tanaka rose and gestured to a chair. "Mr. Robinson, thank you for coming."
The Kaito Group is prepared to offer £140 million for a majority stake in Glen Ardach and exclusive global distribution.
140 million. More money than I've ever seen in one sentence. That's a considerable sum. You'll understand if I take a moment before giving any answer.
Absolutely. In addition to the capital, we would offer you a permanent seat on the board to guide future strategy.
A seat on the board to watch them dilute my spirit into another conglomerate brand. This isn't partnership, it's acquisition. I'll consider your proposal and be in touch within the week.
They exchanged a formal, measured handshake. Polite, but the distance was already clear. Then he walked out of the glass tower, the city indifferent to the fortune he'd just been handed.
If I take their money, it won't be to cash out. It will be to open every door that was slammed in my face.
Back at Glen Ardach, Alexander met with his lawyer in the quiet of the distillery office.
I won't sign a deal that just lines my pockets. The money has to build something bigger.
He pushed a single-typed document across the desk. Its title, Robinson Whiskey Apprenticeship Program.
Full scholarships, mentorship, guaranteed placements, black distillers, trained from day one.
The lawyer set his pen down and removed his glasses. The silence carried every warning he wouldn't say aloud.
He thinks I am risking 140 million for a dream. Maybe I am.
That night, Alexander dialed Hiroshi's direct line. The phone rang twice before Hiroshi answered.
I have one non-negotiable condition. The deal must fund a black-led apprenticeship program, full scholarships, permanent.
There was a long pause. The only sound was the distant hum of the cooling equipment.
That goes far beyond our original scope. I must consult the board.
The Kaito board meeting was tense. Hiroshi relayed the apprenticeship condition, and the silence that followed was heavy.
An untested social program embedded in a luxury acquisition. The investors will not like this.
Within hours, the whisper of the condition reached George McAllister through his network of aging loyalists.
An apprenticeship program. Now I can bury him for good.
He called his contact at a tabloid with a single sharp headline. Headline: Glenn Ardach's production, too tiny for global deal insiders question. Consistency. The headline spread through the whiskey trade like a virus. In Tokyo, the board watched the article trend. The mood shifted. Murmurs replaced the earlier excitement.
The optics are turning sour. If this taints the brand, we may have to walk away.
He sent Alexander a single line. The board has concerns. We must discuss. Alexander read the message and set his phone down on the still. He did not hesitate, because he already knew the answer.
If they need proof, I will give them proof that cannot be argued with.
Within the hour, he had emailed every respected blind tasting panelist he knew, including the critic who had once praised his sample in secret. 3 days later, in the same stillhouse where he had walked alone after the tasting, the panel assembled. The event streamed live. The Glen Ardach 12 was poured blind. The critic who had praised it weeks ago nodded before the glass even reached her nose.
They're tasting what George McAllister spat out.
The scores were unanimous and breathless. Every expression rated above 90. The 12-year-old scored 96.5 from 4 independent palates. The tabloid that had run the smear issued a full retraction within the hour.
The board watched the live stream. Your condition is accepted. The apprenticeship program will be part of the final agreement.
For the first time since the tasting in Speyside, Alexander allowed himself a full, unguarded smile. The deal was back on. The next afternoon, heavy footsteps on the gravel outside the stillhouse. The door swung open without a knock. George McAllister stood in the doorway. His tweed waistcoat rumpled, his face a mask of barely contained fury.
You think a blind tasting changes anything? The old guard will never accept you.
Is that why you drove all the way here? To tell me what I already know?
I can still make this go away. There's a private arrangement to be made. You step aside, and you'll never have to worry about money again.
A bribe. The last resort of a man who's lost everything. You've mistaken my patience for weakness. I don't need your arrangement. I have a deal that will reshape this industry.
George's face hardened, the last veneer of civility gone.
You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it.
You will leave my distillery now, and you will never set foot in it again. The door is behind you.
The stillhouse fell silent after George's departure. Alexander stood alone, his hands resting on the warm copper. The only sound the low hum of the spirit running through the pipes. That afternoon, in the distillery office, his lawyer confirmed the apprenticeship fund was ring-fenced at £15 million, untouchable by any future board. His phone buzzed. Hiroshi Tanaka's name on the screen. Alexander picked up.
The board wants the signing ceremony to be held at Glen Ardach to make a statement. Would you agree?
My distillery, where it all started. Yes, I'll agree to that.
The call ended. The sun was setting over the highlands, long shadows stretching across the distillery floor.
47 years. A mortgage. A bottle that was spat out, and it all comes to this.
He stopped at his desk, picked up the framed photograph of his father, and held it under the lamplight.
You taught me patience. Now they'll see.
He set the frame down and walked back into the stillhouse, where the spirit ran quiet and constant, the only witness to the promise he'd made. 3 days later, the press descended on Glen Ardach. Satellite vans, camera crews, whiskey bloggers with bright ring lights. The small gravel lot was full. In his office, Alexander straightened his collar, then glanced at his laptop. A new email blinked. The sender, George McAllister's legal assistant. Mr. McAllister demands a full apology for your unfounded aggression and threatens legal action for interference with his business.
A lawsuit from the man who spit out my life's work and came here to bribe me.
He moved the email to trash, then emptied the folder.
Not today. Today belongs to the spirit.
He straightened the charcoal sweater, checked his watch, and walked out of the office into the still house. Outside, the press pack turned as one. Hiroshi Tanaka's car was already pulling in.
140 million pounds. But the weight I still feel is the bottle I carried out of that tasting room.
He stepped into the morning light to sign his name into history. The ceremony took place under a white tent outside the still house. A polished table, 2 chairs, and between them, the contract.
This pen weighs more than the spittoon ever did.
He signed with one slow, deliberate stroke. Hiroshi received the pen and added his own signature. Then they rose, and the handshake was firm, unhurried, the cameras capturing every frame. Alexander turned to the press, his voice soft but steady.
The first act of this new partnership is the Robinson Whiskey Apprenticeship, fully funded for black distillers. Permanent, starting now.
The journalists erupted. Shouts, applause, the clicking of cameras drowning out the silence of rooms he'd once walked out of. In his oak-paneled office, George McAllister watched the live feed. His untouched whiskey sat on the desk, his face frozen. A courier arrived with a thick cream envelope. The seal was Glen Ardach's own. The card inside read, "A personal tour of Glen Ardach. Anytime. Robinson." He stared at it, then slowly, deliberately, crumpled it in his fist. The press tent was still buzzing when Alexander led 6 young black aspirants onto the raised platform. Each held a copy of the Whiskey Bible. He handed the first copy to a young woman from Glasgow, Maya. Her hands trembled as she received it.
The book that named his whiskey the best in the world. And he's giving it to me. This page has Glen Ardach's name, but the next page is blank. That one belongs to you.
She opened it to the spread where 97.5 was printed. The cameras zeroed in. The image of a black woman holding that score outside a Highland distillery hit the wires instantly. Alexander watched the scene like a man who had finally finished a long pour.
Every door they slammed, every letter of rejection, it all led to this moment. Not revenge. Renewal.
He stepped back, letting the apprentices have the spotlight. The future of Scotch stood on that platform in 6 pairs of hands, and somewhere, a man stared at a crumpled invitation, while the world cheered a new generation. 1 month later, the apprenticeship classroom was alive with the sound of pouring spirits and quiet concentration. Alexander moved between desks, pausing at Maya's. She held a covered nosing glass, eyes closed.
Oloroso. Heavy sherry. Second fill cask, I think. She has a natural palate. Better than many masters I've known.
After the session, they stood alone by the spirit safe. The question she had been holding finally came.
Do you ever think about the man who spat out your whiskey? Every time I pour a glass, I am grateful. He showed me exactly who I didn't want to become. An insult that became a door. I won't forget that.
Alexander looked at her and saw the future of the industry. Not a reaction, but a creation. Outside, the Highlands stretched quiet under the same sky that had watched him walk out of a tasting room. 4 years later, at the Whiskey Bible Awards Gala, the final category was called Rising Star Distiller of the Year. The recipient, Maya Okonkwo, head apprentice of Glen Ardach, the same trembling in her hands that Alexander had once steadied on a raised platform outside a distillery.
I want to thank the man who refused to let an insult be the last word.
From a balcony shadowed from the stage lights, Alexander stood as still as the copper stills he had left behind.
The next page isn't blank anymore.
The ballroom erupted. A standing ovation for a black distiller trained in the program he'd fought to create. Alexander didn't stand. He just nodded, once, like a man acknowledging a debt finally paid. Somewhere in the highlands, a small distillery hummed on, its future secure in hands that would never again be turned away. Late that night, Maya walked into the still house. The amber glow found Alexander alone, holding the same brass nosing glass he'd carried back from the tasting years ago.
You still use that glass? Every anniversary of the world's best. I fill it once. Tonight, I thought I'd share.
He poured 2 drams of an 18-year-old expression, the spirit darker and deeper than the 12 that had changed everything.
I taste Glenardach's patience in this. Sherry, but a whisper of peat now. You've graduated from apprentice to distiller.
They drank without a word, the quiet of the still house holding the moment.
That wall right there. That's where we'll hang your plaque.
Maya looked at the blank stone, then laughed, a full, open laugh that echoed the copper and the years.
Next year, you'll be the one pouring for the new class.
A year later, 10 graduates of the Robinson Apprenticeship had taken positions in distilleries across Scotland. At Glenardach, a new wing bore a bronze plaque, in recognition of those who opened doors when others closed them. Alexander, now 48, stood in the rain outside the old stone venue, where Sample 7 had been poured. He did not go in. He simply looked at the door he had walked out of, years ago in that same measured silence.
That room cannot hurt me anymore.
He nodded once almost to himself. Then he turned and walked away, the rain streaking the warm lights just as it had that night. The place that had tried to break him was now just a location. The door that had once closed behind him now stood open to a generation, and somewhere in the highlands the stills ran on. Sunrise spilled gold across the highlands, finding Glenardach where the stills had never stopped. Inside the barrel warehouse, a young black apprentice knelt before a single cask. A handwritten note was taped to its oak head, in Alexander Robinson's writing, faded but firm. For the next world's best. The apprentice tapped the bung free, and the spirit ran into a tulip glass, catching the morning. The color was deep amber, 20 years of patience in a single stream. The apprentice nosed it, eyes closed, and for a moment the warehouse was perfectly still. The apprentice lowered the glass and looked toward the open warehouse door. The light poured in, and the note on the cask seemed less like a promise than a fact. The stills hummed. The door stayed open. The next world's best was already in the glass.